All right. Well, looks like folks are joining us. We're starting to slow, so we'll let folks join us as they are able to log on. But I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for joining us on this Tuesday to learn about spring ephemeral wildflowers and their pollinators. We are really thrilled to have both Liz and Kent joining us today. For those who may not know, Kent is a conservation biologist with the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, where he directs the Vermont Atlas of Life, studies the rare Bicknell's thrush, and many other research efforts. Trained as an ornithologist, I love this, he describes himself as an accidental entomologist and has become an expert on the diversity of insects found throughout the Northeast and elsewhere. He's also a conservation photographer, so a lot of the photos you'll see in here are Kent's, an avid naturalist and devoted conservationist. So thanks, Kent, for joining us. And for those who don't know Liz Thompson, Liz is an ecologist and botanist with a deep passion for nature and an abiding lifelong interest in patterns of plant distribution. She's a conservation scientist with the Vermont Land Trust, where she brings nature conservation to the working landscape. She's co-author with Eric Sorensen and Bob Zano of Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, a guide to the natural communities of Vermont. So welcome to you both. My name is Caitlin Cusack. I'm a forester with the Vermont Land Trust. I'll be moderating and answering any technical questions. So before we get started, just a quick Zoom housekeeping. I assume everyone's pretty familiar with Zoom at this point, in it being 2021. But if you'll see on the bottom of your screen, there's a number of little icons. One says Q&A. And if you click on that, we would love it if you would enter your questions in the Q&A. It's easier for us to keep track of that. If you are having any problems, you could message me using the chat. Please enter it there. I will also put my my cell phone in the chat if it's easier to just give me a call if you're having any trouble. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liz and Kent.
Great. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Thanks everyone for being here. It's great to know that you're there, even though I can't see you. And this is really one of our favorite topics and love to talk about this. And it's been a wonderful spring to observe the spring wildflowers and, see them emerging. I'm just completely honored and pleased to be working with Kent on this. Kent McFarland is just a wonderful colleague and very knowledgeable, and he knows a lot more about this stuff than I do. So great to be with you, Kent. And so let's see. And Kent, you want to read this?
Yeah, we're going to hear a little bit more about Henry David Thoreau, but because he was an avid wildflower watcher. But I love this quote: "I do not know that the woods are ever more beautiful or affect me more." I just think he sums that up so great. Right, this time of year is just wonderful to be out there in the woodland.
Great. And Henry David Thoreau, my childhood home was very close to where Thoreau lived in Massachusetts. And here's an outline of our talk. And we're going to start with flower structure, then talk about ground dwelling of spring wildflowers, their habitats, pollination and dispersal. Then that will be the majority of the talk, actually. And we'll weave these things all in and out of the talk. Then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about a few trees and shrubs and some aspects of climate change, what we're understanding about climate change, and that's where Thoreau comes back into the picture. And then Kent will talk to us about citizen science, about resources and what we can do, what you can do to help us understand more about these spring wildflowers. So here's what we'll do as we go through. We'll have the outline highlighted in red for what we're going to be doing next. So a little bit on flower structure, just to get us all on the same page. This is a red trillium, also known as wake robin. And the petals are the red part. The sepals are the green part on the outside. Collectively, they are called the calyx. The petals are collectively called the corolla. Interior to that, you have 6 bodies here, not counting the bug that's there, 6 stamens. And the top part of the stamen is the anther. That's where the pollen actually is created and is shed. And you can see there's actually some little tiny pollen grains that have been shed onto the petals of this flower. And then interior to that, there is a stigma, which is the top of the part of the flower that holds the seeds. And this is a 3-parted stigma. Think of sticky. So this is the part that the pollen then sticks to, and the pollen grains then grow down into the ovary. And I learned recently from a museum visit that the word calyx actually comes from the word calyx crater, which is a kind of ancient, this is from Bronze Age Greece, this piece. And the calyx crater is a kind of water vessel. So again, the word calyx comes from that. But cut open that flower lengthwise, and you can see that below those stigmas, there is an ovary, which is the part of the plant that where the seeds grow from the pollination that occurs. Okay, with that in mind, so we might use some of that terminology throughout, just so you know. And then now we're going to just really kind of dive right into the flowers, the plants that live on the forest floor. And just a couple things about habitat, a couple of the natural communities where you can really, focus on finding some spring wildflowers. Now you can find spring wildflowers in, almost any kind of woods, but especially in hardwood forests, and especially abundant in dry oak maple limestone forests, which are found more commonly here in Vermont in the Champlain Valley. And these are the warmer climate areas of Vermont, enriched soils with limestone or dolomite bedrock. And here the wildflower diversity is great. And then northern hardwood forest illustrated here, and also the more enriched version of northern hardwood forest, rich northern hardwood forest. These are places where you can focus on finding spring wildflowers, and particularly look for moist areas and often on east-facing slopes. You'll have better luck than on sort of dry west-facing slopes finding spring wildflowers. Now, Ken, you want to talk about this phenomenon?
Well, what I get really excited when I start seeing this, which are these tree wells, the melting snow around the heat of the tree trunks. I get excited for wildflowers when I start to see this, because it turns out that the early wildflowers rely on some of these wells. If you show the next slide, Liz, there's been some work showing that the first place to melt, the snow melts, is around the trees in these wells. And right down there next to that tree is a highlight of these early wildflowers popping up. So you can even start to find wildflowers when there's still, a foot or two of snow around, if we've had some sunny days where we get these tree wells coming out. And it might be really important for early pollinators, some of the early bees coming out, to have these wildflowers popping up around trees. So this is a little sort of microcosm going on right around the trees in these wells. I just think it's a neat thing to get really excited about wildflowers when you start to see this melt.
I recently took a trip to Mount Equinox with a friend who's a photographer, and we were looking at the bases of the trees, and that's where we found an abundance of wildflowers, including the spring beauty, which I think it might be the thing that's in this previous slide. That
it is, yep.
Mm-hmm. And so we found bunches and bunches of spring beauty at the bases of trees. This is our most common spring beauty, the Carolina spring beauty. And you see those, the stamens are out of focus in this photo, but the point of the photo is to show those lines leading to the yellow spot in the center of the flower. Kent, what are those for?
Yeah, there's a lot of flowers have these. They're called nectar guides by some, but most people are now calling them floral guides. They're sort of advertisements for pollinators on where to go. Like, hey, follow this line to the goods. And the reason they're called nectar guides originally was because we thought mostly they were after the nectar, but it turns out we'll learn that flowers have more than nectar. There's all kinds of stuff that pollinators are after. There's pollen, nectar, but there's also oils and resins and different scents and waxes they're getting too. So that's why we like to call them floral guides now. And some plants, like, for example, sunflowers in your yard, some plants, you won't see these guides, but actually, if you put UV light on them, boom, all of a sudden they show up. So got to remember that a lot of these bees, like this spring beauty mining bee that you see in the corner there, they're seeing in a spectrum that we can't even see in. So we see these nectar guides, and they're probably seeing this even brighter than what we're seeing. Incidentally, the spring beauty mining bee really relies on literally on spring beauties, this tiny little bee, which is maybe a few millimeters in length. We only discovered it in Vermont last year in 2020 during our wild bee survey, and it's now known from 5 counties. So we're discovering new bees, new pollinators here in Vermont all the time, and this is one of the little ones.
So interesting. Here's another one of our favorite spring wildflowers. The spring beauty is one of the ones that flowers very earliest, one of the very earliest things to flower. But I think that the first thing that I have seen in my hometown now of Jericho is bloodroot, this plant. It's one of the very earliest things that I see, early April. This thing starts to flower. They call it bloodroot because it has a milky, a red sap. If you actually cut the root, which this is a picture of somebody else having done that, you'll get a red sap. It's in the poppy family, so this characteristic is common to that family. And the flowers actually are wrapped around. This is the flower that has emerged, but the leaves actually wrap around the flower and protect it as it's emerging in the early spring from the cold weather, the cold temperatures that we can have in early April. So these are petals. There are 8 white petals. There were 2 green sepals on this flower, but they drop very, very early. So often the sepals of a flower will protect the flower in bud. But in this case, in the case of bloodroot, the protection actually comes from the leaf rather than the sepals. And there it is emerging.
That's really neat. Yeah, what we're seeing here on this bloodroot flower is a female mining bee. They're called mining bees. They're some of the earliest bees that come out here in Vermont. They're called mining bees because they nest in the ground. So they sort of dig a hole in the ground or in the side of a hill. And this one right here is in the middle, gathering as much pollen as it can to carry back to give to its young. That's high in protein, so it's really important. But bloodroot is a trickster, though. It doesn't have any nectar, so it sort of suckers the bees in there. Some of the bees in there thinking they're going to get a really tasty nectar treat, but all it has is pollen. So in the case of this mining bee, that's fine. It's gathering up all those together to gather the pollen off of them, all the anthers. But for some bees, they're just tricked into coming there and then leaving just to carry the pollen around.
So the pollen is a nutritional value, but some of them would just as soon, they'd rather have dessert, right?
They'd rather have the sugary, sweet dessert and not the pollen. Yeah.
Neat.
Here's another mining bee, and this one I watched actually wandering around and around and around the flower trying to find where it could get nectar. It was clearly frustrated it wasn't going to get a sugary treat, but you can see its hairs are covered in pollen. So when it flies away and goes to another bloodroot plant, it's delivering the pollen. So it got a little bit tricked and frustrated.
That's cool. And here we have the petals of the bloodroot fallen to the ground now, and the anthers, and so it's gone by. This is in early or mid-April. This photo, and there is the fruit of the bloodroots. This is a pod, we can call it more sort of generally, or a capsule kind of fruit. And inside that fruit
are these, which are the seeds, and they have this weird gray stuff attached to them. This is a seed pod right from the wood lot in my backyard that split open, and I just took a close-up of it. And those little attachments to the seeds are actually really important, and they happen to be on a lot of our spring ephemeral wildflowers. They're called Aliosomes, and they're basically a little fatty tissue that's attached to the seed capsule, and it's a present mostly for ants. And it's asking ants to carry the seed away. So ants will come up here and grab them, but also it turns out recently discovered is wasps are also doing this. Wasps are coming in and doing the same thing, carrying the seed away so they can have that rich little dessert attached to the seed. And if you show the next slide, you can see it a little bit closer how it's attached. There's the seed and there's the Aliosome. And then the next slide will show an ant, which is actually harvesting one. So these winnow ants will wander around on the forest floor searching for these seeds, grab a hold of them and take them back to their nest to feed to their young. But they're only going to eat that fatty tissue. They ignore the seed. They actually, once they're done feeding on it, they'll take the seed out and put it in their dump. And so what happens for the plant? Well, one, the seed gets dispersed a certain distance. Two, it gets to go underground, and so it's hidden away from mice or any other thing that might actually devour the seed. And three, the ants dump it in their dump where there's more rich nutrients for it to sprout up. And so this little mutualistic relationship between the ant and the plants is really amazing. It turns out too, if you actually remove all the winnow ants from the forest, you'll reduce sprouting of the plants by 50%. So they're really reliant on these ants carrying them around to get them germinated and get them spread out in the forest floor. So it's a really neat process that happens with not just bloodroot, but with a bunch of the other spring wildflowers too, this ant dispersal with these Aliosomes. The other thing is, and I know Liz you'll see in the next slide after this that Liz wasn't happy about this, but it turns out there were some recent studies looking at deer scat, which we have here. How often do you get to show poop in a slideshow? But here we are with deer scat. It turns out that deer scat actually has a considerable amount of wildflower seeds in the scat that will germinate once they're left onto the ground. So deer do transport some of the seeds. One study looked at Trillium and found that on a pile like this, there could be 30 to 40 Trillium seeds in that scat ready to germinate. So they are transporting some of the seeds around too, which is, it's a little bit bittersweet. It's great that they're transporting, but as the next slide that Liz has shows, Liz, tell the story about this.
Last spring, I talked about spring wildflowers, and after the talk was over, I was just feeling like I needed a walk in the woods, and I went out into my backwoods where I had photographed some Retrillium, and this is what I found. The deer had overnight decimated this population of Retrillium in my backwoods. I was so mad.
And it's really curious because Trillium actually is not supposed to be that palatable to herbivores. It's supposed to have calcium oxalate, which is basically the crystals that you find in over-the-counter meat tenderizers. So apparently it shouldn't be very good on their tongues, but here they are nipping it off. And because they're dispersing the seeds later that we found in studies like that, they must be nipping them off even when they're seeds too. But yeah, I guess this is a pretty good example of why we don't want too many deer. You can really have a tough time in the understory if you have too many deer.
Yeah, in the neighborhood where I live in Jericho, there are definitely too many deer. There's very little regeneration of woody plants. The thing in the background is a cherry, which are not palatable to deer. So there really are too many deer. And this was probably a female deer in the spring of the year, pregnant deer needing nutrition, needing something and desperate. So eating something that maybe not was particularly palatable, but just, eating whatever she could find. Yeah.
I will mention here too, that also not only deer are bad, but earthworms, as long as we're talking about things that are bad for the understory. Just quickly, most of the earthworms, if not all the earthworms we have here in glaciated areas like Vermont are introduced earthworms. They're Asian or European usually, from the old world section of the world. And if there are too many in the understory, you can find places where there is little herbaceous layer. The layer of duff is really eaten up by the worms. And so a lot of us think, we're taught about how worms are really good for aeration and everything, but it turns out in the forest, they're really bad for the forest if they get overpopulated too. So it's another bad one for wildflowers.
And if earthworms are not great, I want to just go back for a second to the ants and make a note that I had meant to make earlier, which is that older forests, it has been found that older forests, old growth forests, and old mature forests tend to have greater diversity of wildflowers than younger forests. And that might be, Kent, having to do partly with the ant dispersal. So you take a forest and clear it for agriculture. It takes a long time for the ground flora to return to that forest, even after the forest has returned. Could that be in part because the ants, it just takes a long time for the ants to get back in there?
Yeah, and imagine how far they're dispersing them, even when they're back. It's not, the distance for an ant is not far. So it would take years and years and years to disperse seeds around.
Right. Okay, well, let's go on to another one of the very, very early spring wildflowers, a favorite. This is round-lobed Hepatica. There's 2 species of Hepatica in our forest, round-lobed Hepatica, and you can see the round lobes of the leaves here. And sharp-lobed Hepatica, you can see the sharp lobes of the leaves in this one. These ones are, this is an interesting thing because it's in the buttercup family, and a characteristic of the buttercup family. If you look at this flower, it's got lots of stamens, an indeterminate number of petals. It can have anywhere from 6 to 12 petals, and a bunch of ovaries in the center of the flower. And so there you can see that more clearly in this photo. And they can come in different colors. They can be pink, blue, or pure white like this one. And here is the Hepatica it has 3 sepals, and now it's losing its petals.
Shoot, can I throw a question in? So the color of that, does that have anything to do with soil types or anything, or we don't really know?
I'm glad you asked, because I sure as heck don't know. And I don't think, I have not seen any literature that supports that idea, which is an idea that many people have. But my impression of it, or my understanding of it, is that it's more like eye color in humans. It's a genetic thing, and it has nothing to do with habitat. In fact, I've seen bright blue and pure white flowers growing within an inch of each other in the woods. So there's no indication that there's anything about habitat, but thanks for asking that, Kent. I'm glad you did. And here's another couple plants that are favorites. This is a plant, and this one I need to attribute to my friend and colleague, John Tagliaferro, who I told you I visited Mount Equinox with recently. He took this photo there. This is Dutchman's Breeches, which is so called because it looks like a pair of Dutchman's pantaloons hanging on the line. This is in the same family as bleeding heart, if you have bleeding heart in your garden. In fact, I was visiting a patch of woods with a young friend the other day, seven-year-old friend, and she said, "Oh, I know that plant. I have that in my garden. They're bleeding hearts, except they're white." Yes, exactly. Nice. And go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, these are really important for queen bumblebees early in the spring. This is one of the first flowers that the queen bumblebees are going to go after. So just quickly, if you recall about bumblebees, they're social bees, so they have a hive. And at the end of last year, when the killing frost came, all the bees died except for the new queens. They went underground and hibernated and spent underground all winter long. And when springtime comes, just when these flowers are just coming out, boom, the bumblebees come out, dig themselves out of the ground, these queens. And the first thing they need to do is get some nutrition in them. They've used up a lot of their fat supply, sort of laying underground all winter long. So they need nutrition so they can get healthy themselves, get a little energy, and then start a new hive. And so they're looking for these spring wildflowers, and this is one they're going to go up right after. And it's literally kind of built for bumblebees. So you see how this bumblebee is hanging off of the I guess that's the petals that are hanging off the bottom of it. And it has a very long tongue that will go the whole way in and the whole way up into those sort of horns, or the pant legs of the plant, I guess you could, of the flower. It's good. The tongue is going to go way up in there to get after the nectar. In the meantime, it's positioned perfectly to get doused with pollen all over the hairs on its belly. And the next flower it goes to, boom, it's going to land the same way and then brush its belly up against the stigma of the next flower and put it all over it. And the other thing you'll note here too is this queen, on her leg, on her rear leg, you can see she has a little patch of pollen there. That's a specialized spot on their hind leg called the corbicula, which has little hairs going over it and an indentation in her leg, and they mix their spit with pollen, and they make a pollen loaf in there that they're going to carry back to their colony to be fed to the young when the young hatch out of eggs too. So this plant is extremely important for the new queen bees that are coming up out of the ground in the springtime.
Hey, Kent, occasionally I have seen, if I don't know if you can see my cursor there, but occasionally I've seen like this little part of the flower having been nipped off.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's nectar robbing. We should have tucked a picture in of that. I have one too. What happens is some of the pollinators that don't have a long enough tongue, they cannot reach the nectar treasure at the end of that little horn. And so they cheat and they'll bite through it and then lick it all out. And it bypasses the whole pollination system of the flower. And so they're called nectar robbers. And it happens with a lot of plants that have those long, I don't even know what the technical name is, Liz, of that long horn thing on the flower, but of that long piece, if that's there, you'll often find bite marks in them.
Yeah, it's just called the spur, but yeah.
The spur, there we go.
Legs. And how
Hopefully
about,
everybody remembers what these are, right?
and these are from the Dutchman's Breeches, right?
Yeah. Yep. And the same thing you'll see, just as we saw with the bloodroot, we've got these Aliosomes here that it's the same thing. They're going to be harvested by ants, carried away, just like we saw with bloodroot. So it's the same deal going on.
So lots of the spring wildflowers are dispersed that way, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's neat. And that's a lot of energy to make that Aliosome, right? That's a fatty body, right? So it must require a lot of, nutritional energy for the plant to create that. So it's worth doing because it disperses the plant.
Yeah, the payback must be big because it is energy cost. There is a cost to that for sure.
Yeah. And there's
another ant carrying it away. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, neat.
And the thing is I would just say, get down on your hands and knees and look for this too. If you find a patch later on that has seeds and seeding, get down on your hands and knees and watch for a little while. You will find some being carried away by ants if you're diligent about watching like this.
One thing we should say, Kent, which I think most people here probably understand, but the reason that there are so many spring wildflowers blooming in the early spring is because there's no canopy on the forest. There's a lot of sun coming to the forest floor, and so there's a lot of activity going on. And this is when plants can photosynthesize, when a lot of insects are moving around. But just to your last point, I wanted to remind people. So here's the flowers and the foliage of Dutchman's Breeches in the early spring, but by a month from now, those leaves will be gone. They will have done their thing. You will not find those leaves on the forest floor. They will be gone. So we call them spring ephemerals because they are ephemeral, because they do their thing and then leave. However, if you're observant, like Kent was just describing, and keep an eye on where you had seen these things, you will find the fruits, the seed pods a little later on with mature seeds, and that's when to go and look. The leaves will be gone and the flowers will be gone, so it'll be harder to find the plants. But keep your eyes out for those fruits on the forest floor, and then you can find those seeds with the Aliosomes. Another related plant is squirrel corn in the same genus, and also even this one looks maybe even more like a bleeding heart. But it's called squirrel corn because its underground parts are these little things that look like little grains of corn. Another one of our favorite early plants is early blue cohosh, Colophilum gigantium. There's actually 2 species of blue cohosh in Vermont. I didn't know that until recently, but there are, and they weren't always recognized as separate species. But this is a weird looking thing when it comes up, this sort of space age looking thing, space alien looking thing. And this is the flower of, this is our friend Brian who took this photo. And this is interesting because these purple things are not petals, but those are sepals. And these things inside the sepals are actually modified petals, and they are modified into glands. And so, Kent, you were talking about the different substances that are available to insects in flowers, and perhaps this gland is producing some, I don't know if it's a nectar or some sort of other substance. Do you know?
I don't know for this plant, but I'm sure if it has a gland, I'm sure something is collecting it. And now I'm going to go out and watch to see what it is.
Yeah, don't know what. Here in this photo, there's something approaching here, and there it is getting closer to the flower.
Yeah, and that looks like some kind of wasp. And we forget about we think about just bees. It's always bees are the pollinators, but there's so many other things pollinating, and wasps are accidental pollinators too, because they're harvesting pollen just like other things to go back and feed to their young. So it's probably collecting pollen.
Great. And here's the fruits of the blue cohosh. This photo was actually taken this year, but these are last year's fruits. So it's a dark blue fruit. And the most important thing to know about this is don't eat it. It might look to some like blueberries, but it can be deadly poisonous. This is actually a medicinal plant. Blue cohosh is a medicinal plant that is used in a similar way to black cohosh, even though those two plants are not related. It's used for things like inducing childbirth, inducing labor, and sort of related things related to that. But it's like any herbal medicine, it's something to be used with under the direction of a professional. So don't eat these fruits.
The interesting thing is that birds do eat them. And unlike those other plants that had those fatty tissues attached to them, this one relies on bird dispersal. So somehow, I guess the birds aren't bothered by it or whatnot, but they are the major dispersers of the seeds of this plant.
Great, interesting. Another plant that is one of the early flowering ones is wild ginger. And here's another plant that is you can see, this is hard to see, but the flower is red. And there's another red flowered plant, which we talked about at the very beginning, Retrillium or wake robin, otherwise known as stinking Benjamin or nosebleed. I have a friend who, when I gave a talk about this last year, I think, or he might have said something like, oh gosh, I know that plant. When I was first betrothed to my now wife, I brought her a bouquet of these flowers. And after a day or so, she said, what's that horrible smell in the house? Ken, what do you have to say about that?
Well, there's a reason why both these plants are like kind of a fleshy color and they smell, because they actually attract flies. Flies are the major pollinators of both of these plants. And the last plant you showed even has the flower down near the ground, especially for flies, because flies are underground, and in the early spring, they come out from underneath the ground and they're crawling around on cold days, and they can crawl right into the flower without even flying. So the smell, the sight of them, everything sort of honestly looks and supposed to smell a little bit like rotting flesh to attract carrion flies, which I think we have a picture of in the next slide, perhaps.
Yeah, and this one is.
Yeah, they're all carrion smelling.
Yeah, and this one's a slightly better. It's hard to get a picture actually of the wild ginger because the flower is on the ground and it's often in shade. But my friend John Tagliaferro took this wonderful photo at Mount Equinox the other day.
Yeah, it's easy to miss the flowers of those ginger plants. They're really tucked down in, sometimes even underneath the leaf litter.
Yeah.
Yep, and there's a typical carrion fly, those bright green flies you see flying around. So, yeah, they're fooled into going into these flowers and getting a little pollen all over them and going into the next one. So they're accidental pollinators.
Another trillium, one of our most common trilliums, and this is is white trillium or Trillium grandiflorum. This one only grows in the western side of the state. Naturally, it can, I think you've said that it's planted at Billings Farms, perhaps in the eastern part of the state. You can plant it and cultivate it and grow it, but as in the wild, we're at the eastern edge of its range. So it's really only in the Champlain Valley growing in the wild. Another early favorite is Trout Lily. And this one, I just, again, our friend Brian Pfeiffer took this great photo. And I want you to notice that the stamens in this flower are red. and the stamens in this flower are yellow. There are two different stamen colors in Trout Lily. And again, we don't know the reason why, and we think it's probably simply a genetic difference. I can sometimes see a whole patch of yellow stamened ones, and then up the trail a ways, there'll be a whole patch of red stamened ones.
Yeah, you can see the bee also approaching it. And that's actually a mining bee, but it's a different species than the one I have listed there. But it is a type of mining bee. But there is a specialty, Trout Lily mining bee, a kind of bee that only goes to trout lily and specializes on trout lilies. And it's another bee that we didn't discover in Vermont until 2020. We had no idea it was here because people weren't really looking until we started looking. And so it's one of over 300 species of wild bees that we now know we have in Vermont. So pretty cool.
And what's this?
This is a bee fly. And so it's a bee mimic. It's a group of flies that look like bees, but bees have 4 wings, and you'll notice that this just has 2 wings, but it acts the same way. If you're careful on a sunny day looking around, especially trout lilies, I see them all the time around trout lilies. They'll be buzzing around after nectar around them. So once again, here's a fly that is a great pollinator. And in the next photo, you can see how long its proboscis is, how far it can reach into that flower to lick up and lap up that nectar. It's a really cute fly, I think, for as far as flies go.
I think it's pretty darn cute.
Yeah.
That's great. And here's the trout lily leaf again. And I just want to say a little bit about how trout lilies get around. In addition to producing seeds, being pollinated, producing seeds, they also reproduce vegetatively a lot. And so later in the year, again, this is a spring ephemeral. And so these leaves will be gone in a month. But in just a couple, 3 weeks, you'll begin to see these things on the ground, these funny little white worm-like things. These are actually overground runners that are produced by the this trout lily leaf will produce from its base one of these little runners, and you see the leaf is now gone. It's now just gone, but this runner is produced, and at the tip of it is a new plant. A new plant will grow there next year. And so you'll often go into the woods and you'll see a mass of trout lily leaves. None of them have flowers, or maybe only one has a flower. And these are all produced vegetatively in this way. Now it takes, after this occurs, it takes 6 to 7 years for the new little trout lily plant to get mature enough to produce flowers and fruits and seeds. It takes a lot of energy to produce a flower with its nectar and pollen, and especially to produce seeds. So it takes a long time for the photosynthesis in the plant to just gather up enough nutrients at the base of the plant to do that work. So it takes 6 or 7 years. And during that time, the underground part actually burrows its way underground, so that by the time you've got a flowering plant, its basal part is actually about 6 inches underneath the surface of the ground. I don't recommend going around digging stuff up a lot, but if you ever, were in a place that was going to be sort of disturbed anyway or developed anyway, you might go digging around at the trout lilies, the ones that are flowering, and you'll see that they are that far under the ground.
Wow.
It's neat. Another one of my favorite plants is early meadow rue. This one just popping up. And these are the leaves of early meadow rue, sort of unfolding like a deck of cards. I love this. These photos were taken at Wake Robin in Shelburne a couple of weeks ago. And this is an interesting plant. Now, the word dioicum comes from the word dioecious, which means Di meaning two, oikos is the Greek word for house, just like, and it's the root word of the word ecology, the study of our house, our home. And so there's two houses. So there is a separate house, a separate plant for male flowers, and a different one for female flowers. So this is the same species, female and male, and these are generally wind pollinated. So these little, you can't see it in the picture because I don't have a video, but these were just, just shaking in the breeze, shedding their pollen, and that was being blown over to the female flowers to fertilize them. And that's my understanding. Kent, do you know, do insects also visit these flowers?
They definitely, there's often flies on these. I'm not sure what they're doing necessarily on these. There's other things collecting the pollen. with a lot of plants that are wind pollinated, if we start really looking at them, we find out that there's a lot of pollinators visiting them too. And, maybe accidentally pollinating them, but they're after a meal for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. All that food that's being produced. What the heck?
Yep.
Yeah. Here's one just emerging. Here's one of my favorites. This is large flowered bellwort, Uvularia grandiflora. And this is a plant that grows in rich woods, rich northern hardwood forest, or those dry oak maple limestone forests where there's a lot of nutrients in the soil. What about the bellwort mining bee?
Well, it's really interesting. It specializes on bellworts, all the different bellwort species. And the cool thing about this mining bee is it's about 1.5 millimeters long. It is tiny. And the way it deals with these bellwort flowers is it crawls, because it's so small, it can crawl the whole way up into that flower to get after the goods that are buried deep up in there. So unlike the giant bumblebee, which is using a long tongue to lick the stuff out, this one is using its tiny size to crawl up there and get after the reward.
Neat. That's interesting. And this is another kind of bellwort. This is sesame bellwort or wild oats. Now, this one grows in more commonly in really any kind of woods. It doesn't have to have especially rich woods. So you'll see this one more commonly. There's lots of violets growing in our woods in the springtime. What about the violet mining bee?
It's another one of those early spring Adrena mining bees that specializes it specializes on violets. I tucked it in here with your yellow violet, but it actually prefers any of the violets that are blue. It sort of ignores yellow and white violets. It really likes to go after these blue violets.
Maybe this one. This is the long spurred violet, which is, you can see this very long spur here on the violet, but this is one of the common violets we would see in the springtime woods. Would it maybe visit this one?
It definitely could, for sure.
Great. Great. And just a couple more things, a couple more ground dwellers, and then we'll get on to some other stuff. This is a beautiful thing called bishop's cap. If you look closely at this, the petals are fringed like a snowflake. Why is it called bishop's cap? Well, on the left-hand side, here's the fruit of this plant. Whoops. And on the right is a picture of the Episcopal Bishop of Vermont, Shannon McVeigh Brown. If you can see that, her bishop's mitre is what that hat is called, is similar in the way it's set up to the bishop's cap fruit. So they also call this plant mitrewort, and that's why it's called mitrewort, after the mitre that the bishop wears. Another early plant that we both love is early saxifrage. There's a typo there, excuse me. And there it is close up. Beautiful spring wildflower.
This is one of my favorites, Jack in the Pulpit. If you find a moist, wet place in the forest, you're probably going to find Jack in the Pulpit, and it's such an interesting plant. It's another one of those plants that's a little bit of a trickster. It's purplish color for a reason, and it smells a little bit too. So it attracts fungus gnats, these tiny little specks of gnats that fly around and usually lay their eggs on fungus. Well, it tricks the fungus gnats into going down into that tube. And there's a male and a female for Jack in the Pulpit. So the male, which the male flower can be formed on a plant in, say, maybe 2 or 3 years of growth, it'll start to form a male flower. It attracts these fungus gnats to go zooming down inside that. Is it called a spathe? Is that what it's called? Yeah, zooming down inside that spathe. And inside there are all the anthers with all the pollen on it. And so the fungus gnat is attracted and goes down in there. It can't go back up because there's a hood, so it's fooled, and it bangs around in there until it gets a whole bunch of pollen stuck to its hairs. And then at the bottom of the male plant, there's a little slit where the fungus gnat can crawl out and fly away. And I'm sure after it's like all dizzy and disoriented, it flies away, and then it finds a female flower, and it accidentally gets duped again. And so we're looking at a female flower here in this picture. And here's the problem. Once it goes down into a female flower, it's never going to come back out again. There's no opening at the bottom. So it goes down inside the female flower and bangs around in there, knocking pollen off of itself all over the place. and often eventually just dies inside the flower and lays at the bottom of that flower inside. And you can actually, this is one where I opened up and I shook the dead fungus gnats out onto my piece of paper there to take that picture. They're literally dead in there. They don't come out. So they're tricked into going into the female flower. The crazy thing about this too is that these plants produce heat, and the fungus gnats are attracted to the heat also. So there's the color, there's the smell, and there's this heat to get them to go into these flowers and finish the pollination. The crazy thing is for a female flower, it takes about 20 years until a plant will make a female flower. And they've been documented to live maybe up to 100 years for a female plant. So, we think of these little herbaceous plants as just here and gone, but there's old growth jack-in-the-pulpits out there.
That's
basically.
Cool. That's cool. And they can start as a male when they're young and then convert actually to female later in life, right?
Yeah. Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
The other tidbit I just will throw in here that I found out a bunch of years ago accidentally over in New Hampshire is I got into a patch of jack-in-the-pulpit way out in the woods, and they were all dug up, completely dug up everywhere. And I had no idea what was going on. And I messed around trying to figure out what was digging them up. And I thought, is a human doing this? What's going on? And I ended up finding out that actually when bears come out of hibernation, they seek out jack-in-the-pulpit. They love the root. But it turns out, just like the trilliums I mentioned, jack-in-the-pulpit roots have calcium oxalate, that meat tenderizer in them, but a lot of it, to the point where if you would chew on that root yourself, you would get a bleeding tongue for sure. It would just destroy your tongue. But for some reason, the bears come out and they go wild for it. They dig it up and they chew the roots up like mad. I don't know if it's some kind of like celebratory chewing of roots or something because they're out of hibernation, but no one knows why they do this, but you will find that you'll find areas where they'll dig this up and eat up the roots, even though they're poisonous.
Wow. Fascinating.
This is a really cool plant because here's the thing: is the color red. Bees are not attracted to color red. What's really attracted to color red are birds, and so Columbine is actually advertising mostly to hummingbirds, and they're perfectly designed hanging down with all those stamens and the pollen hanging off of them, so that when hummingbirds come up from underneath to reach up and stick their tongue way up in there to lick the nectar, you can see how this ruby-throated hummingbird, its chin is all dusted in columbine pollen. So that flower is absolutely designed for birds to come and pollinate it. And this really isn't a spring wildflower, but I couldn't resist throwing this in here. This is jewelweed, which is more of a summer flower, but I had to share this because I just think this is fascinating. If you go in your backyard or somewhere moist where you have jewelweed is a really important flower for bumblebees and for hummingbirds. They're really specialized for hummingbirds. And some work out of UMass a bunch of years ago showed that if you see that long horn coming out of the bottom of the flower, back of the flower there, that long horn is where all the sweet sugar nectar is. And so they have to reach their tongue around that bend into the end of that. And so when they come up to it, their tongue is going in and out super fast. And when it happens, that flower is bouncing on that flexible pedicel there, that little stem that's holding the flower. And that stem is tuned to the rate that the hummingbird's tongue goes back and forth, so that it bounces perfectly to the tongue of the hummingbird and taps the pollen onto their forehead as it bounces back and forth. And so they have super high res, quick photography showing how it's happening, and it just goes bang, bang, bang. It keeps hitting it on the forehead. And then when it goes to the next flower, it gets harvested off their forehead. So that's flexed to exactly the tension of a hummingbird's tongue, which just blows me away.
Wow.
And the great thing is that, we talk a lot about things that are declining, but hummingbirds actually are doing really well. Here's 2 citizen science projects that folks that are listening might have helped with: the Breeding Bird Atlas of Vermont and what's called the Breeding Bird Survey, which is a roadside count. It's all done by volunteer expert bird watchers. And so we've had about a 2% increase in hummingbirds in Vermont over the last 50 years, and the Aliosomes, they're increasing, so they're doing really well, which is great news. But to keep them doing well, the next slide is a hint of what you can do. I always like to show people things they can do. And the next slide is what you can do if you drink the right kind of coffee. And don't be like Joey and wonder what, but buy shade-grown coffee. Hummingbirds in the wintertime really love shade-grown coffee plantations. And so if you buy shade-grown coffee and drink that, you're helping support these shade-grown coffee plantations where most of our hummingbirds are spending the winter.
Great.
I just got joined by my cat. I hope you can't hear it meowing too much. Yes.
Here's another later flowering thing, but so fascinating. Can you tell us about turtlehead? And
yeah, I just wanted to throw this in because earlier we mentioned that there's more to flowers than just pollen and nectar for pollinators and other herbivorous animals that are visiting them. There's all kinds of chemistry that's going on. And it turns out that some flowers have different kinds of chemicals in their nectar that they're supplying to insects. And so in this case, the nectar of turtlehead is actually mildly poisonous to insects, except it turns out that bumblebees will seek it out at certain times. And so here's a bumblebee coming in to land on that turtlehead flower. It's going to crawl in there and actually drink nectar that is mildly poisonous. If we look at the next slide, it turns out this is we have to throw a little bit of science graphs in here, but basically the zero marker going across there, if anything is above that line, it has no effect on the bumblebee. If anything is below it, it has great effect. And the effect is that it gets rid of gut parasites. So bumblebees have parasites and they start to feel sick. They'll go to different kind of flowers like turtlehead when they feel sick, and they'll actually drink the nectar of those flowers, which probably makes them feel even a little bit more sick, but it actually kills or at least reduces the populations of some of these gut parasites. So in effect, they're actually drinking medicine for themselves. They're making themselves more healthy in the end by mildly poisoning themselves with some of these chemicals in these flowers. And this has worked from somebody right here in Vermont, Leif Richardson, who did all this work when he did his PhD thesis a few years ago, showing how important it is for these bumblebees to have this kind of, I guess, medicine, we'll call it, available to them to help them stay healthy.
wow, that's fascinating.
So we're going to talk about quickly about two butterflies. One of them on the left side of the screen is called the West Virginia white. And then a more common butterfly that you'll see at the same time is called the mustard white. And the big difference is mustard white in the springtime has really dark veins, and West Virginia white has these sort of ghost blackness around their veins. But the cool thing about West Virginia whites, if we see the next slide, is that they only fly during the time of spring ephemeral wildflowers. And this is a flight chart showing how in May, sorry, I'm going to close my door so my cat stops trying to join the party here. He's very curious about wildflowers.
And probably butterflies too.
That's right. And so they're flying right when the woodland wildflowers are out and about. And here's why. The West Virginia white is probably one of our few butterflies that is a true woodland butterfly. It will never leave the woods. In fact, if you parcelize a forest and put a field all around a forest where there's West Virginia whites, it will not disperse outside the forest. It hits the openings and refuses to leave the forest. It's tied directly to this spring ephemeral wildflower, which is toothwort. And so it has to come out early in the spring right away, lay eggs on the toothwort. The eggs have to hatch right away, like you see in that picture there. It has to eat really quickly on toothwort and then form a chrysalis before that plant dies back. And you remember Liz mentioning how fast these plants have to operate before the canopy closes over. And that's what has to happen with the West Virginia white. They have to get all their business done before that plant dies back to its underground rhizomes. The problem is that we have garlic mustard, which is an introduced species that came into Long Island years ago. And many of you probably have this around your yard and you've seen it. And where it gets into the woodland, it actually has a chemical that makes the West Virginia white thinks it's laying eggs on toothwort, but it's not, it's garlic mustard. And when that young caterpillar hatches out and begins to feed on this plant, it almost immediately kills it. And so it's a dead end. The adult wants to lay the egg on it, but the caterpillar can't survive on it. So you hear people trying to get rid of garlic mustard, harvest it, and get it out. And one of the reasons is to help protect some of these populations of West Virginia whites.
I hear sometimes people saying, so it's not native, big deal, what's the problem? But this is a real problem and a real reason to want to control a plant like this. So I'm glad you talked about this, Kent, because it's not just, well, it's going to maybe displace native plants. No, it's a real problem for the West Virginia white, right?
It is. It's a big problem.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to just quickly talk about another group of plants that's in the woods, which are the sedges. And this is a close-up of plantain leaf sedge, one of my favorites, just because they're really fun. They're in the spring woods, and just to appreciate them. And then we're going to talk, I'm just going to whip through a couple of photos of trees and shrubs, and then ask Kent to talk a little bit about climate change and citizen science. We've only got a couple minutes left, so we want to sort of move right along and then leave a couple minutes for questions. So in the early spring woods and wetlands, you'll see willows. And I just wanted to show you that this is from last year. And this is a male flowers of willows and the females. And then a couple weeks later, the male flowers of the same willow shrub and the males maturing. Here's leatherwood or wickapea that flowers very early, speckled alder, beaked hazelnut, one of my favorites, shadbush, which is blooming now. And then the trees, just don't forget the trees. There's so many trees blooming early in the year. Red maple, there's the male flowers, more mature. And when they're done, when their male flowers are done, they're dispersing their pollen, they just fall to the ground. They're done. But there's the female flowers having received the pollen and beginning to mature into those little fruits that we know of as the maple fruits, the samaras, or the helicopters, we sometimes call them. And this is sugar maple. This was a couple of weeks ago, and this is about what it looks like now with both male and female flowers mixed in the same cluster. Ken, would you talk a little bit get back to Thoreau a little bit and talk a little bit about what we know about climate change?
I said we would, mentioning him again, and here we are. So Thoreau and also a professional photographer, Hosmer, they lived around the Concord area, of course, and they both were very interested in plants and wildflowers, and they both recorded the flowering time for the plants around where they lived. And Primick, a man at BU, Boston University, found out that in their journals, they had listed the dates for all the first flowering times for lots and lots of plants around the Concord area. So he and his students dove into those journals and pulled out all the data they could from the journals, and it had the year and the flowering time and everything. And then they went back and did the same thing in the same area, found the flowering times again. And so you can see in that chart what they found over time between Henry David Thoreau and Hosmer, that about 7 days earlier on average for spring wildflowers, they're flowering 7 days earlier now, a week earlier. And if you look at that a little bit differently, what's it mean? When is the mean first flowering date versus spring temperature? Well, you get a similar line. It's about temperature. And we had two wildly warm springs in 2012 and 2010. And again, the flowers followed right along with that. They were super early, the earliest ever recorded in a couple hundred years. So it's really interesting work just from two guys that just were keeping track of flowering times. And so I started doing that. If you look at the next slide with this, I started doing that a little bit around my area. So I started following bloodroot, just keeping track of that. And the next slide, you can see bloodroot, it flowers in the springtime. So the blue is the flowering. And if you keep track of it and put it into iNaturalist, as I'll show you in a second, keep track of the flowering with the blue, and it'll also keep track of the seeding with the orange color. But it turns out if you do it year in and year out, in the next slide, first and foremost, let's look at that spring temperature real quick. This is the spring temperature average in Vermont. So you can see annually it bounces up and down all the time. But on average, since 1895, we've seen a pretty good rise of a couple degrees in the mean spring temperature. And so that's going to affect the wildflowers over time, but it does bounce around a lot, as you can tell. So let's look at my bloodroot data that I just collected. Here's my bloodroot data from my little bloodroot patch near my house. I just went out every year and looked to find out when it first flowered, and boom, put it into iNaturalist, and I get this chart. And you can see really warm years like 2010, it came out really early. And in really cool years like 2015, it was almost in May by the time it flowered in my little patch. So it follows mean air temperatures in the springtime nicely. So it's an interesting way to find out what's going on over long term.
Neat.
This is just sort of what it looks like. So here's 1st of April in 2016, and the thing is flowering. And then 1 year, it isn't until the 20th of April in 2014 when it flowers. So it's just like Henry David Thoreau. I'm just going out there, except I have a smartphone. I don't have a journal. The other cool thing is that's a little bit scary is that so the wildflowers that they worked on are flowering about a week earlier in this chart. But it turns out the leaf out and the canopy over top is 2 weeks early. And so as you look at mean spring temperature, the warmer and warmer it gets, you get a convergence eventually of the canopy leafing out too quickly for the wildflowers underneath them to actually get their business done and store enough energy. And it's also bad news for West Virginia whites because it compacts their life history into too short of a period too. So their caterpillars can't feed enough to go through all their growth before the flowers die back too. So we don't really know why, but we think that it takes longer for the ground to warm up than it does for the tree limbs to actually warm up in the air. And so they're speedily leafing out with climate change, and the ground takes a little bit longer to warm up, and it takes more for that to change. And so they're not in sync. So the trees are faster leaf out than and it's going to be bad news for the understory if it gets too close, like at the end of that chart right there. And so a lot of this, again, is just done by citizen science monitoring, and it's easy to do. Like you can be Henry David Thoreau. You can go out. It's use iNaturalist. It's a free smartphone app, and we have a project called the Vermont Atlas of Life, where you can put literally anything wild you find in Vermont in there. And in this case, it's wildflowers. You can put all the first flowers you ever see. It records where the date and where you were, and so we'll have the elevation you're at and the time you saw it flowering. And when we have enough of that kind of data, then we can start seeing patterns that might be happening across the entire region when we put it all together. But also, you get to learn too. It's a great place to help people help you identify the flowers if you're having trouble. And so it's just a great place to learn in a great community too. And this is just to show you there's some really quick tutorials to get started with it, and it's completely free. And there's amazing naturalists on there like Brian Pfeiffer and others who just jump on and just help all of us learn a lot too about what we're seeing. So I really encourage you to do that to learn, and also help us just collect more data for science and conservation too.
Great. That's great, Kent. Thank you so much. And I've used iNaturalist. It's a massive treasure trove of data. So it's great. We're going to send you some other resources as well, some books that we especially like, some other resources that we like. But Caitlin, if you want to come on, and I don't know if you want to go to the final slide of upcoming events first. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Liz and Kent, thanks so much. What a awesome and fascinating hour. And Kent, you made my day with 2 new discoveries in 2020. So it's not a total loss of a year. So that's really Trout Lily. What was it? Trout Lily mining bee and the Spring Beauty mining bee for those.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So thanks everyone for joining us. We'll take some questions, but for those that need to hop off, just wanted to make a couple of announcements here. One is you check your email for a follow-up. We'll be sending you a survey, and we really do take your feedback to heart. So please, if you can take a minute to fill it out, that would be great. We've also recorded this, and so within a week, we'll be posting the recording to YouTube, and we'll send that link into the in that follow-up email. And then, just some really exciting events coming up that both Kent is part of and that the Vermont Land Trust is hosting. So Lost Lady Beetles on May 4th, the science of Vermont's climate, women's estate planning, again, more of the lost lady beetles, birding on conserved land, gardening with summer wildflowers. A lot of that you can check on either the Land Trust or North Branch Nature Center, some of those websites. And then finally, for those that have made donations, we really appreciate your support. We are a member-based organization. And so for those that would still like to make a donation, the link is in the bottom for both the Vermont Land Trust and the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. So with that, I will we've had a number of questions come in for both of you. And so if you both are willing to stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes, we can start working through some of those.
We've gone a little bit over time, but we'd love to stay on a few more minutes and hear people's comments and questions.
Great, that sounds great. And Liz, maybe if you want to take down the slide, then they could see you both in their screen when you answer. So this is a question that came in from Jean Elizabeth, and it relates, Ken, to what you were talking about with climate change, and just wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more. And Jean Elizabeth she said, have spring flowers tended to emerge much earlier than the pollinators this year? And so, you discussed that a little bit. She said her peach and plum trees have bloomed and are fading, but we've seen very few bees. I've noticed the soil or ground is still cold. I've noticed very little presence of pollinators, both where I live in Winooski and hiking the woods throughout Chittenden County. So I know you talked about the West Virginia white, but are you noticing any sort of asynchrony between pollinators and this shift in flowering times? And is there concern there? Maybe you could address that a little bit more.
I don't know if there's any good data about that, but I mean, it's known that there are some springs where the weather doesn't cooperate for certain plants when they're flowering, and you could get a stretch of poor weather when the apples are flowering, for example, and it keeps all the bees from flying about, because the bees need to be around 48 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe a little bit colder for bumblebees. They have to have it really reasonably warm and sunned or sun to fly around. So if you get a stretch of weather that's awful, kind of like right now, the flowers are hanging out there, but there's no pollinators out and about because they're too cold. They can't fly unless they warm up enough. So there's a lot of variation annually, depending on what's going on in spring and just by chance alone with weather patterns. Over time, whether there's asynchronous, if there's things happening where bees are coming out too late and things like that over and over again, I'm not sure we have very good data for that yet, but we can predict that that's probably what's going to end up happening, that they can be out of sync for sure, or not have enough time. But so far, it's really what you see, just given the chance of weather that happens. If we get socked in with low pressure systems over and over and over again, it's just the bees can't fly. And that's what we've had recently around here right now.
Great. Super. Thanks, Kent. And a question from Alicia. Did the spring beauty bee newly move north with climate change, or was it just not seen before until 2020?
No, that's a good point. We just never found it before until we started looking. And in fact, Spencer Hardy, who's my partner in arms on the wild bee survey we're doing right now throughout Vermont, with Spencer working so hard, he and volunteers have found, I think we're up to 45 new bee species for Vermont. And that doesn't mean that they recently moved in or that they're new to science or anything. It just means that no one was looking. And so once we start really trying to find out what wild bee species we have, native and introduced out there, it turns out there's a lot more than we actually knew when you start looking. And so the spring beauty minor bee is a case of just not looking hard enough. There's plenty of spring beauty and we could have guessed it was here, but nobody documented it. The other thing I will say that's really cool is that spring beauty pollen is bright pink. And so if you're in the woods and you see a bee flying around that has pink on it, it's almost certainly was just its spring beauty. So
So Ken, should people be taking photos of bees that they see and sending them put into iNaturalist to help?
We've had several new bee species discovered in Vermont from that very thing happening. People photograph even in their backyards. We've had 2 bees, I think, that I know of discovered in people's backyards, new to Vermont, from just doing that, Liz, taking pictures of them, really pretty good pictures, trying to get close-ups. And we have a couple of experts, including Spencer, that are good enough that about maybe 60 or 70% of the pictures they can ID the species, believe it or not. So it's really, really helpful to do that for sure.
That's great. The power of citizen scientists. That's great. So Alyssa is wondering, she lives in Massachusetts, Mount Holyoke Range. And Liz, her first spring wildflowers seem to be Hepatica, but she says we don't seem to have spring beauty. Do you know the range of spring beauty? I know they grow south of here, so maybe it's habitat differences, or they were eradicated here somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more likely habitat than range, because the Carolina spring beauty has a wide range and would occur in Massachusetts, but it's probably either habitat differences or it might have something to do with dispersal after disturbance. I don't know exactly where you're looking in the Mount Holyoke range. So it's hard to know exactly for sure. There's another species. There's 2 species of spring beauty. The other one's called Virginia spring beauty, which has long, narrow leaves, and they are easy to confuse. So it's probable that you haven't seen either one, but the Virginia spring beauty actually occurs further south.
Great. Thanks, Liz. And a somewhat related question when we talk about habitat. Mary's wondering, the soil pH where she is near Round Mountain in Brattleboro is neutral, but she seldom sees wildflowers. And just wondering if you could talk about the association between pH and maybe some of these spring ephemerals.
Yeah, there are certain spring ephemerals like the Dutchman's breeches and the squirrel corn and the large flowered bellwort. And to some extent, Hepatica, like sort of relatively high pH, but if it's neutral, it's actually neutral. That is a high pH for Vermont. So you should have some spring wildflowers there. But the other thing is look for sunny spots, look for east-facing slopes. In the Brattleboro area also, you might have some fairly serious deer browse issues going on there, where the spring wildflowers, in some cases, I met a landowner, after this is in the Champlain Valley a couple years ago, who said, we used to have spring wildflowers and we just don't anymore because of the deer. So that could be an issue as well. Again, hard to say without seeing the specifics, but that might have be a contributing factor.
Great, thanks, Liz. And Ken, question for you. I know you said, ants don't travel too far, but Daniel's wondering if you can give a general sense of what is not too far. How far will they travel?
I mean, we're talking in feet, yeah. Nothing like, which is interesting that recently discovering that things like yellow jackets and some other wasps are also carrying these seeds, because they can fly, in the hundreds of feet, if not farther. So they're probably dispersing the seeds a lot further than the ants, but ants are the main dispersers. So yeah. And yeah, feet, tens of feet at the most.
Okay, that's helpful. Great, thanks. And Liz, follow up to your question related to deer. Joanne's wondering, will the Trillium that are eaten grow again, or is that it?
Yeah, they've got a lot of reserves underground. So yes, they will grow again. And in fact, in my woods, I did observe that they've come back up in the place where they were browsed last year. So I don't know, Ken, if you were talking about Trillium, I can't remember, but many of these plants are very, very long lived. They live for many, many years. And so they've got reserves underground, and they can't even flower or fruit until, they have plenty of reserves. So having been nipped off one year, yeah, they've got reserves and they can come back. Nip them off year after year after year, take off their leaves, take off their fruits. No, that's gonna cause long-term damage. So, a one-time browsing event, they can recover from, but if it's repeated, no. Can't you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I was just actually, as you were saying that, I was wondering what happens when we do careful, when we're doing careful logging, what's what's a couple passes of a skidder do or something if they're underground?
Sure. Yeah. Most of the time, much of our logging takes place, timber harvesting takes place in the winter. Caitlin, you know more about this than I do. When it's taking place in the winter, the underground parts of the plants are not affected at all. And in fact, some of them respond well to the additional light. Caitlin, do you have a sense of that? You're a forester, so you would know more about that than I do.
Yeah, I know there's been some studies or literature reviews to look at that, the impacts of logging on the understory. Most of our data in silviculture is based on the overstory, the trees that we're managing. I know actually, Liz Jennifer, who's one of our staff, has pulled together some of this information. But I mean, I think, as you said, the winter harvest is kind of the safest for protecting those. And there's not a ton of research that looks at that. But certainly the changes in light is an impact. I know Dave Ellum did some look at ginseng and some of its relatives on the impacts of changing light conditions on that. At least found that plant was somewhat plastic or flexible if it happened when the plant was dormant.
Cool.
So questions for you both about sort of propagation and ethical collection. So I'll kind of group these two questions together, and maybe you could kind of answer them maybe together. What Jean is wondering, do sunflowers have a preference for root or rhizome propagation versus seeds? And then Anonymous is wondering, are there any ethical ways to try to sort of gather plant seeds to bring to your property?
I think I'll give a first crack at this, Kent, and then maybe you could help. In June, we are having an event about wildflower gardening, gardening with wildflowers. It's summer wildflower, more later season wildflowers, summer wildflowers, and sort of pollinator gardening and things. So there'll be some helpful information there. The short answer is I would say go to the Native Plant Trust, which is an organization that deals with this, that does this, that propagates native plants, native wildflowers. And I would not go and collect either seed or underground parts yourself from native wildflowers unless you know that an area is going to be changed completely, like developed completely. Then, it's a sort of rescue effort. But other than that, I would go to the Native Plant Trust or another nursery or organization that does this and that does it responsibly. Kent, do you have any other thoughts on this?
No, the only thing I don't really know at all, but the only thing I was going to add is what you hit on, which is if you want to experiment, like do it where a place where they're going to build a house or something and it's going to destroy the whole patch. And then by all means, like if it's going to be destroyed, you might as well experiment and try to move them and see. But it's tricky. Plants, some of the seeds have to go through different scarification processes and all kinds of different things. So like you said, you really have to talk to the pros to find out exactly how each plant is propagated in the right way.
Yeah, but there are a number of these things. Bloodroot is one of them that there are nurseries that carry bloodroot and propagate it responsibly. And that's a beautiful thing that you can grow in your own garden. Some of the trilliums too, you can grow in your own garden, but get them from a reputable nursery rather than trying to get them yourself, unless, of course, as Kent just said, it's going to be destroyed anyway.
Great, super. Thank you. Thank you both for that. I wanted to get a couple of citizen science questions. So for those that are encouraged to go help with that, Julia is wondering if we include information in iNaturalist but obscure the location, does that prevent you from benefiting from the data, assuming you need the elevation, location details, et cetera? Can you help Julie?
Yeah. So it's what she's talking about is geoprivacy, which we take really seriously at iNaturalist in all of our citizen science projects. And you can actually, so two things. One, any rare plants and animals or anything that we feel is over collected or collected is auto obscured automatically in the system. So only I can see it, or a person like me can see where it actually is when it's auto obscured. So things like wood turtles, some of the orchids, they're auto obscured no matter what you do. People can't see. And by auto obscured, it means it randomly puts a point within a 20-kilometer square of where you actually saw it. So, so there's that. And then, but then you can also, as she is mentioning, you can also obscure it yourself if you want to. So maybe you're on private property and they don't really want you to, they want to report it and want somebody to use it, maybe science or conservation, but they don't want the whole world to know where it is. Or maybe you just want to know for yourself where it is. You can actually obscure that also. And there's different ways to do it. And we actually have a white paper that we did teaching you about geoprivacy and iNaturalist. And so the best way to do it is to drop me an email, which is easy to find, and I can point you to that geoprivacy if you're really into that and iNaturalist and how it works and how to do it. But the just short answer is that usually a conservationist like me can see it, but the public can't, depending on the setting you use.
Great, thanks, Kent. And Chad was wondering, he has a picture of bees at Spring Beauties and Trout Lilies taken in their town forest on April 24th. They're both quite nondescript and presumably mining bees. If he has photos, upload them to iNaturalist, can he send them to you, links in Flickr? I guess, what would you prefer? The
best way to do it is to put them on iNaturalist, because I'm going to look at it and say, yes, that's a mining bee, and that's about as good as I am. But someone like Spencer Hardy or some other experts that we have on iNaturalist, including one that's actually in Asia but knows the world's bees, will go on and ID all of our stuff from Vermont for us. They're exceptional. And that is, so if you put it on there, you're getting some of the greatest identifiers of bee photos available to look at it. And if they can't ID it, then nobody can, kind of deal. And then it's saved for everyone to use, for us to use, or everyone to use for science and conservation. So please, yeah, put that on iNat. Yeah, it'll be great. Great.
Great. And maybe just a couple more questions. Just wondering, Kathleen, she said, is it specific types of ants that disperse wildflower seeds? I assume she's wondering, for each wildflower, is there, a specific species of ant, or, how to.
Yeah, it's not like pollinators where there's sometimes specific pollinators going to certain flowers. It's the group of the winnow ants are most famous for this. It's a group of ants that really will go after anything that has that Aliosome attached to the seed. They just want that nutritious morsel on it. So it's really any of them will do it. So they're not plant specific.
Great. Okay, and I'll leave, so the last question from Bruce, regarding these many different bees that specialize, is a specific early spring flowers, what do they do the rest of the season after their early flowers go away?
Some of them are probably done. They do all their nesting and get done early. Their phenology is timed right with the wildflower season. And a lot of them even some of them we used to think were only tied to one kind of plant, or actually we're finding out that they actually will visit other plants too. They're not as specific as we thought once we start to really study them. So they'll switch to other plants to keep their colonies going, or keep their colony going. So it really depends on the species. We're up to, I think, 305 species of bees now in Vermont that we know of. And literally, just like any other group of organisms, each one of them has a pretty different life history involved with them. So it runs the board on what they do, for sure.
That's great. That's great. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kent and Liz, for a great hour. And thanks for everyone who's hanging on to the end here, the Q&A. I think we'll have to wrap up, but as I said, we recorded this, so we'll follow up with some resources from Liz and Kent and the recording link, and then your emails. I know folks, you have expressed, if folks have questions, to follow up by email, so we'll include that in there. And yeah, so thank you again, a wonderful hour. And I guess, do either of you have any sort of parting last minute thoughts or things you'd like to share before we end?
I would just say, get outside, take some pictures, and enjoy everything, and share them, and join the community. It's really fun.
Agreed. And thanks so much, Kent, for this. This has been great to do this together. And thank you, Caitlin, for hosting us.
Well, thanks
Caitlin
again.
And Liz, thank you for inviting me. It was great.
And so you heard that, everyone. Time to get outside. So I'm going to end our
Go
meeting.
outside.
Thank you again. And yeah, we'll see you in the woods.